coming in with us now. All right, hi Michelle. Okay, let's make a start then. It's just turned 1 o'clock, so let's kick off. So this is one of the series of the Insights 22 program for this year, and we're discussing the short-term overseas projects that HMPPS staff are involved in. My name is Brian Pollett. I'm a member of the HMPPS international team, and I've been doing this work now for the past 6 or 7 years. Today's session will involve a number of presentations from people who are currently involved or have been recently involved in overseas projects. And the idea is to try and give you a flavour of what is involved and the type of work that we get involved in. And also it should be for good and for bad. It won't all just be saying this is all wonderful stuff. We all lay on Caribbean beaches all the time, but to give you a flavour of some of the realities of the work that is involved. It's called short-term overseas projects because the projects we're discussing today are normally up to about 3 months in length, each deployment. We do have some deployments that are up to 2-3 years in length, but we'll be discussing them in a similar session next Wednesday. But today is for sessions of up to 3 months. Some basic rules, I think, for today's session, please. When you're not talking, please keep on mute. Otherwise, we're going to have lots of background interference that will cause problems. And we will also be stopping for questions as we go through. So when you wish to ask a question, just put your hand up and then we'll try to get round to as many people as we possibly can. So quick introductions and a run through our session today. You'll be hearing shortly from David Butler-Trump, who is our training manager for the work we do in the overseas territories. David is currently sitting in Terminal 5 of Heathrow, so this clearly shows how up to date and immediate this stuff actually is. You'll then be hearing from Tab Sibanda, member of our NTRG team. Tabs was out and led a team to the Turks and Caicos Islands last year for 3 months secondment to the prison there. So again, some interesting stuff there. Then be talking to colleagues Leslie Giles and Nigel Layton, who do some work in less salubrious parts of the world, and they'll be running through their work there. And then finally to Paul Yates and Sean Ormerod, who recently returned from a 2-week secondment to Bahrain. To put all that into context, HMPPS in its various forms over the years has been involved in overseas projects in all shapes and sizes, hosting visits from overseas countries to here, sending some of our staff out to advise on prison conditions in other parts of the world and how they can best be improved. The current international team was set up in 2015 and really focuses on 3 particular areas. Firstly, there's the overseas territory, the UK overseas territories, which are mainly in the Caribbean, also places such as Gibraltar and further flung places, including the Falkland Islands and St. Helena. Essentially, they're all former UK colonies that have now achieved independence, but still work under the umbrella of the UK government. And the UK government really has an obligation to promote the rule of law in those countries. And the Foreign Office really has set up a 5-year project with the MOJ and HMPPS leading on specific subjects such as prison probation reform and also addressing wider issues such as alternatives to custody and the way that the courts actually operate. So that's one particular area of work we do. The second area is what we call the cadre team, who are a group of 6 people led by a guy called Andy Watts, who are embedded in the Foreign Office here. And they undertake projects in parts of the world that are of specific interest to the UK government, and where the UK government is very keen to actually improve the prison conditions there. And Nigel and Leslie and Andy Nay, who's just joined us, will be talking and describing the type of work that they undertake there. Then the third part is the work that the requests that we receive from other parts of the world for assistance with their prison systems, prison and probation systems. These are usually channeled through our embassies in those countries. And an example is the project undertaken by Paul Yates in Bahrain earlier this year, where the Bahraini government approached our embassy there and asked if we could advise on how their systems could be improved. And Paul will be going through in some detail on that. So essentially, overseas territories, work of direct relevance to the Foreign Office, and then really what I regard as being the other areas, which really encompass all parts of the world, and can vary from us simply sending information about the types of work that we do in the UK to hosting visits here to our staff going out to other places. So there's a really big range of stuff that we undertake. Anyway, what we'll be doing is running through the program, and after various sessions, we'll stop for questions that do come up, and I'll flag that up to people as we go. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to David Butler-Trump. So before he disappears off to the lobby for his drinks and pre-flight nibbles, I'll leave it to David to explain what he's up to. Okay, David, over to you.
Thanks, Brian. I'm already here. Don't worry about that. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my name is David Butler-Trump. I work for the Overseas Territories Justice Programme as the Prisons Development and Training Manager. And the team that I work for sits under the International Rights and Policy Directorate within MOJ. And we essentially are funded by the Conflict Security and Stability Fund, or CSSF fund. And that money is basically given to us to fund our project, our work, our team via the FCDO. Been in this role approximately 2 years now, have a substantial background in the prison service itself, worked in many prisons in London and more recently the Isle of Wight. But the team I work for now provides support to prisons, probation and courts throughout the overseas territories, and this is undertaken both remotely and in territory, and can be for a number of reasons depending on the ask or the situation that we find that territory in. So to give a couple of examples, the Chief Justice in Gibraltar, when I met him, was keen to explore support with training for local magistrates and stenographers. In the prison in Sovereign Base Area Cyprus, we were looking to introduce a probation officer that worked partly in the community and partly within the prison. And currently in British Virgin Islands, there was a need to initiate a full prison review as requested by the governor of the island, John Rankin, and subsequently, as I currently have, a deployment of 3 UK staff, 3 UK prison officers to the prison in Tortola. In addition to that, and many other things that we provide, we do offer access to UK placements and training. Currently, I'm designing a bespoke leadership and development package to enrol overseas territory staff on, basically to invest in the future of their senior managers and future superintendents. However, as I've already mentioned, my main focus is on the prisons, and we have a responsibility, pretty much as Brian outlined, to protect Her Majesty's government by ensuring that the overseas territories are complying with areas including the rule of law and the Human Rights Act. So I need to check that prisons are actually doing that by operating safely, decently and securely, something many of you will be no doubt familiar with either HMIP in terms of prisons and probation. How do I do this? Well, generally will involve deploying, hence me sitting in Terminal 5 at Heathrow as I prepare to depart to Bermuda. What I do once in territory is to provide strategic support and development to the prison superintendent, the senior management team and managers, and as already mentioned, that includes succession planning, to deliver training to staff in key areas such as counter-corruption, intelligence gathering and sharing, and basic jailcraft, certainly to encourage more self-reliance. I will identify short and long-term capital infrastructure projects such as fence replacement, vehicle purchasing, or construction of multi-purpose facility units for the benefit of education or offender management. I also complete what we call a mini audit, which is a form of inspection, but it's conducted as a critical friend. We do this to achieve buy-in from the superintendents and the territories themselves, and also whilst Bristol University work on producing a bespoke overseas territories inspection regime for us. What I do though is a much softer version, but it's no less important, and it allows me to measure progress and understand how the jail is operating, where they're at, and where there's a need for recommendations. Unlike HMIP or the Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, from my experience, I won't provide a raft of recommendations. I will provide key recommendations that are both important and necessary in terms of safety, decency, security, but also that are primarily achievable, be that by the territory themselves or with our support. There are occasions when I deploy jointly with colleagues from other agencies, such as law enforcement, especially if I'm working on an intelligence gathering and sharing project with local police forces, and also as I'm doing today with colleagues from UK Health and Security Agency, or PHE as they were formerly known, to assist with the reviewing of prisons' physical and mental health care provision. And often that can include areas such as prescription and medicine management, because what I've come to find in a lot of overseas territories prisons is that it's the prison officers on the shop floor that will issue prescription medication, which is leaving staff exposed to all sorts of issues and concerns. However, I'm only one person and I can only be in one place and do so much at a time. So there are times when I will need to seek support from Kevin Riley in the Director General's office for me to be able to deploy UK prison staff, usually for a maximum of 12 weeks. So far, I've deployed a custodial manager to the Falklands, 2 officers to Anguilla, and currently I have 3 custodial managers working out in the British Virgin Islands. And I have to say, I can only do this with Brian's help. Brian is one of the main reasons that without his support and guidance, sometimes I wouldn't be able to achieve half of what I do. So thank you, Brian. As actually he's already mentioned, it's never really the beach scene that people imagine. Certainly with UK police officers that I work with in territory who often get reminded that it's like death in paradise. It's not always the case. Yes, you're never far from the sea or the beach, but you tend to sort of drive past it and not see it until at the very least the weekends, which is usually time for writing up reports. However, pleasant working conditions with the sun usually overhead, but all too familiar challenges are time consuming and frustrating, and often this results from a lack of support from local government, where they often do not see prisons as an important part of local business really, and so they're often underfunded, undersupported, and often ignored. Sometimes there's a lack of appetite from individuals such as prison superintendents, managers or staff to support or embrace change where change is needed. Sometimes when we do deploy staff for long periods of time, and they are welcomed more often than not, and change does happen. Quite often, once those staff depart, things revert to type. We also have the political climate, which I'm sure those of you who are aware of recent events in the British Virgin Islands in terms of Commission of Inquiry and the Premier being arrested on drugs charges, can also play a part in how we're perceived and how people engage with us. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of some of what I and what my team does across the overseas territories, of which we engage with 10. I'm fortunate that 6 of those are in the Caribbean, as Brian keeps referring to, but I also do have St Helena, the Falklands, Sovereign Base Area, Cyprus and Gibraltar. So there's a lot to keep me out of mischief, and as we progress as a team, we are broadening our horizons to incorporate probation and the courts more and more, so that we can provide a similar service to them as we do to the prisons. Brian, that's about it from me, if that's helpful.
That's great, David. Thank you very much for that overview of the work that we do with the overseas territories. What I'll do now is pass over to Tab Sabander, who can give you a bit more detail about a project he was involved in last January, February, March in the Turks and Caicos Islands, in the prison there, HMP Grand Turk. So Tabs, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tabani Sibanda, but obviously prefer to be called Tabs. I'm commonly known as Tabs. I work for the National Incident Management Unit at the moment as part of ORU, based at headquarters. I was privileged back in January 2020 to be asked to go on this secondment, 3-month secondment in Turks and Caicos, which was kind of like a challenge for me, which I wanted to go and make a difference there. Obviously, I don't want to repeat what Brian and Dev have already said. TCI is a UK overseas territory. Obviously, its own administration operates under the same umbrella of the UK government. And obviously, we had HMP Grand Turk, which is the only prison on the island of Turks and Caicos, which houses up to 80 prisoners. They went through a period of unrest in 2019, August time, where they lost the jail, and where, because it's a small island, the prisoners are related to the staff. So corruption was also rife as well. Hence, the support was requested for us to try and restore some stability, and train staff as well. So we had over 103 applications for ranging from prison officers to custodial managers to come and fulfill the other 3 slots as part of the team that I was leading. I was lucky to be part of that interview process with Brian, and we managed to get a custodial manager from HMP Liverpool, Steph McGrath. Also, Michaela Miller was a CM as well at HMP Downview, and a prison officer called Tyrone Tracy. So they were part of the team that I was mentoring. I was lucky enough that I went out 4 weeks before they arrived in Turks and Caicos. Obviously, Dev Butler-Trump was already out in HMP Grand Turk, so he kind of like took me under his wing when I arrived. Obviously, the operation of HMP Grand Turk is loosely based upon HMPPS, but their systems and conditions are very different to those that exist in any of our prisons. The conditions at first were a massive eye-opener for me and really made me appreciate what we have here back in the UK. There was no proper wired-up lights, a pipe at the back of the cell for their drinking water, with a bucket to use for their sink, some with broken toilets, some broken gated cell doors, hardly any items in the cells. At night times, it was dark because there was not much lighting. And obviously with the temperature, what people go to the Caribbean for, it's lovely and hot. But with that, it brings a lot of mosquitoes as well, which we experienced during our deployment. Obviously, before I took the deployment, I was taught to approach this with an open mind by Dev Butler-Trump. And I'm grateful for that advice, because it took me a few days to absorb the differences between our ways of working and the way TCI people work. But then for me, my ultimate goal, I knew that other people had been before to assist with the managing of the prison. But as soon as people returned back to the UK, all the systems that were put in place or the changes that people have helped the locals to implement were kind of like forgotten. So my approach was obviously to gain the trust from the locals, the prisoners themselves, to show that we're there to work with them. You know, it wasn't about us telling them what to do. So I adopted the philosophy that, you know, you can feed someone for a day, but if you teach them to fish, they can be self-sufficient, which is the approach that I took in terms of trying to train the locals. It became apparent that some of them were in post ranging from 2 years to 5 years that never had basic training as prison officers. You know, they've just been employed and learned from others on the job. So we kind of like had to implement a training plan for the basic prison officer based on what we do here in the UK, but we had to streamline it so it was tailor-made to fit the needs of the locals as well, so we could get a buy-in from them. So as part of the security processes as well, they were more or less non-existent. So I had to set up more or less the security department, of which the superintendent had chosen 2 staff. So I kind of took them under my wing, and we went about setting up searching processes for the prisoners, for the staff, to just try and bring some sort of stability within the jail. So that was well received by the staff. There were pushbacks to start with, because not everyone likes change. And part of the thing was also the cultural change, trying to change that culture of what people were accustomed to, or we've always done it this way. Why should we change? But it was about telling people the benefits, to look at the bigger picture, which really helped us, as the staff were very welcoming and very warming to us, to be honest, and the prisoners alike. So I went to set about like a regime management plan, which was non-existent as well, and created a regime for the prisoners. Really looked at the staffing profiles and staffing rosters, as those were now the new issues, as the safety side of things had a bit settled since the new superintendent took over in October, and it was just about trying to empower staff and equip them with the skills required in managing a prison on a day-to-day basis. And like I already mentioned earlier, the difficulties we experienced was where Grand Tech is a small island, everyone seems to know everyone and they're all related to each other. So that presented challenges in terms of threats to staff. People that have been deployed in the past have had their cars set on fire because the prisoners were not happy with the changes that were being made, or the staff were not being happy about being challenged. So that's a risk that we were fully aware of. But luckily for us, that didn't happen to us. As like I said, also the staff were really welcoming, and they could tell that we're making a positive difference in terms of moving the service forward. We then introduced things like rehabilitation, which was non-existent as well. And I'm happy to say now the department has now changed its name as well, from HMP Grand Tech to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, where they're now linking in with the local probation service as well, where I believe further work needs to be done around probation and rehabilitation, as the two have just recently been put together. And I think further input will be required from the overseas territories to help with the resettlement side of things and probation services. But I'm glad to say, since we've left, I know it was a short-term deployment, but my overall aim was to make the changes more long-term, so people can feel empowered. And I've maintained links with the superintendent and the staff at Grand Tech, because I was personally invested in making a difference. And I felt that myself and my colleagues, we delivered and we made that difference. And the prison continues to grow from strength to strength, which is why I'm still offering them advice and support, even though my deployment ended back in April of 2020, which was a tough time for everyone. That was in the midst of the pandemic as well. But I'm happy to say that we feel that our deployment, our 3 months in Turks and Caicos, has made a difference and continues to develop the prison further. So that's about it in terms of the work that we did. The downtime, yeah, there's lovely places where people could go, you know, the lovely beaches in the Caribbean. But for me, it was about working 7 days a week. So it's not a holiday when people think, oh, I'm being deployed abroad, I'm going to go on a jolly. Yes, you do have your downtime, but I think for us, it was making sure that we made that difference. And I feel that as HMPPS, we walked away with our heads held up high, and we still continue to support them as well. So that's that in a nutshell from me, and I'm open to any questions if need be.
Okay, thanks very much, Tabs, for that very useful description of the work you're involved in. It's the important thing, as Tab says, is actually not just going there for a short visit and then leaving and nothing changes. It's actually about how we can embed those changes and make sure that work, the investment that is made, really does pay off in the long term. And we've actually got an officer from Manchester Prison going out to TCI in June to deliver some further training, really to build upon the work that Tabs and his team already have done. So that will be an ongoing piece of work. And also, as we move from the immediacy of prisons and get into probation work as well, I can really see some good opportunities coming up for probation staff as well. Right, before we go to the next presentation, can I just ask, does anyone have any questions at this point? Anyone would like to raise anything, to ask any questions of the people who've spoken so far? Bethan, yes, question from Bethan then, please.
Hi, Brian. Yeah, just in terms of what you said in terms of the expansion potentially with probation staff and maybe there being opportunities, where would staff look out for those things being advertised or, yeah, more information really?
Okay, the way we normally do this, and I should say the work, I suppose, traditionally has been around prisons, been focused on prisons, because it tends to be prison conditions that causes most concern to the various countries overseas who are looking to improve what they've got and also avoid international criticism of the way they operate. Probation, I think, is internationally is far less developed than prison systems are. So I think that's really why the work we've been involved in has really been on prisons rather than probation. But I can see that changing in future years. The way that we operate is that if I'll get on to Nigel's team in a minute in terms of the permanent members of the international team. But for example, with the secondment that Tabs undertook last year, we actually put an advert out across HMPPS to say this secondment is coming up, invited applications from people who were interested and had the right skills behind them to actually deliver the work that we were after. And then we went through a full SIF process to do that. So that's the way we'd normally operate. Occasionally we get requests for delivery of training, for example, in particular subjects. Those might be familiar with 5-minute intervention training that we do. A couple of staff from our prison safety team were invited to go out to Australia to deliver that work to staff out there. So then we get requests like that. We will actually target those to those particular groups who have those skills involved. And often it does involve people with a learning and development background. So looking forward to probation opportunities for secondments overseas, then they would be advertised again through HMPPS. And I would normally then also contact senior managers within probation to say these opportunities are coming up. Please alert your staff to them if they wish to apply. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks very much.
Lovely. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, sorry. Yes. A question from Akash.
Hi there. I just wondered, in terms of the role itself that you guys have when you're going out, though, it's obviously quite advisory. What's the level of kind of authority that's had if, for example, like you were to visit these prisons and they were like human rights were being breached, and it was like, you know, there were really significant issues that needed immediate change. I mean, what's the level of like influence that you can have at that point?
Tabs, do you want to try to do that one from your direct experience?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one there, Akashi, now, because we all felt it when we turned up there. Yes, there is guidance in place, but which is not similar to us back here in the UK. There's still obviously the human rights element and the health and safety side of things, even though the infrastructure was a bit dilapidated, you know. I know the prisoners, they seemed content, they were happy in their surroundings and the staff, but it's just about putting some guidance in place or checklist on how we keep on top of things like health and safety. But yes, they've got something that they work towards, similar to our PSIs and policies that we have here in the UK. But I think theirs is only about a 10-page document across site. But for us, likely the superintendent as well and his background, and the governor, Nigel Darkin, the governor of Turks and Caicos, is obviously it's all about human rights, so we kind of had to reinforce that as well with the staff in terms of those changes. But obviously we had to lead from the front, so it wasn't just a case of being advisory, sitting behind the scenes. We were kind of working day in, day out as well with the locals and the prisoners. Hopefully that answers you.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I just wondered, for those that seconded officers, like the prison officers and detention managers that are going, are they acting in the capacity of their role, the equivalent here in England, or are they also advisory in terms of their position there?
Yeah, so with some of the stuff, like with the 3 staff that I had, they still had to kind of like act within their role as a prison officer, but we also had to adapt to the ways of working for the people of Grand Tech, because what we do back in the UK might not necessarily be the right fit for HMP Grand Tech. So we kind of get to also, in a way, you know, not lower our standards, but we kind of had to bring them up and meet them in the middle some way, so we can just get an even balance there.
Yeah. I think to add to that as well, I mean, it should be emphasised that our staff remain HMPPS employees at all times. So we go out there as representatives of HMPPS. Now, as Nigel will no doubt describe shortly when he talks about his experiences in Nigeria, our staff can be faced with very difficult working conditions in the prisons that they visit. And to the point of actually saying, are those conditions acceptable? Should we be here? But then it's a question of then realizing that we are guests in another country, and we then have to act accordingly and try and advise and improve wherever we can. So even though we may well regard a situation as being very, very challenging and difficult, we have to try and improve it. It may be by small steps rather by major change. But if we did find, I think, something really, really bad, then I think we would simply just withdraw. We do have that ability to do so, and then report our findings back to the relevant Foreign Office officials in that country, and also back to HMPPS. So it can be a challenging one where diplomatic skills, I think, really do have to come to the fore. But yeah, it's walking a tightrope sometimes. HMP Jamestown, I guess that's there's a question from there then, please. Out in St Helena.
Hello, Brian. It's David Brickland here, probation officer. Good to hear, Tabs, what you were saying in Turks and Caicos. But one comment you made about the staff saying, we've always done it this way. So what I will say is it's really good to hear of the progress, but do you have any plans to go back and review it, say, after 12 months, because there could easily be a regression with the staff having that sort of attitude? Thank you.
Yeah, like I said, obviously, I've managed to keep in touch with the prison. I attend their weekly meetings on a Monday, so I'm part of those daily briefings as well. Yes, I would like to go back at some point to kind of review the progress that's been made. But unfortunately for me, I'm unable to be freed up to go and pick up on that. So to some extent that I'm even happy just to go for a week as a holiday for myself, just to go make sure that everything is still as it was when we were there. But I'm reassured by the superintendent at the moment that things are just going from strength to strength, which is evidence from the staff that I talked to as well during the morning briefings. So that's a bit reassuring for me. But yes, I would love to go back and just to see where things are.
I mean, David, also this is an issue that comes down to resources, because the work involved, the overseas secondment work, obviously is quite expensive in terms of flights, accommodation, and so on. The bill is normally met either by our own Foreign Office or by the governments, the receiving governments, if you like. And if the money isn't available, then we simply can't go. And so as much as we would like to follow things up, it's not always quite as easy as we would like. Having said that, of course, there is the great advantages of the internet. We can provide information online. We can provide support by sessions such as this. But yeah, it's not quite the same as being there, actually on the scene, seeing for yourself. Okay, I think that's all the questions I can see. All hands up. Have I missed anybody at this stage?
There is just a comment in the chat bar.
All right, okay. As you can see, I am not particularly. What was the comment, please?
It says, do these roles require previous prison officer or operational experience or other non-op prison experience also considered?
I think the experience has to be relevant to the ask, if you like. What's the point of the secondment? So if the secondment is to improve prison conditions and the way that prison officers operate, then clearly operational experience is required. If it's actually about setting up a new service, and particularly something like the probation service, then I think it would be direct experience of probation delivery would be important. Non-op stuff, I think it depends what it is. If it was about policy development, so for example, about 5 years ago, we were asked to assist Macedonia with the development of policies for a new probation service. So therefore, I think non-op experience in writing policies and coming up with draft legislation would be directly relevant. So it really does depend, I think, upon the nature of the secondment and the work that's likely to be involved. Okay, I think let's move on then to our next stage, which is the work of the cadre team, who are all HMPPS employees, but they are embedded in the Foreign Office, undertaking work in various countries which are of direct interest to the UK. And Nigel is one of the members of the team. I'll hand over to Nigel to describe the work that he delivers. So it's Nigel and Leslie on this one, please.
Okay, we've Leslie's just come on screen, as has Andy Nay. One is in West Africa currently, one is in East Africa currently. I'm going to test my my IT skills. Just like Brian, I'm not brilliant on this, so I'm going to try and share a short PowerPoint presentation that we'll talk to. Is this working? He asks. Aha, right, okay. Can everyone see that, or somebody see that? Somebody wave at me?
Yes, it's up and running.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. Okay, so just a gentle introduction, slide one. This is our home office currently. This is the Foreign and Commonwealth office on King Charles Street in London, which we visit occasionally. Most of us are either abroad or working from home when we're back in the UK, but clearly there is a requirement to go down to London on a regular basis for meetings. So this is where we do our work from. As per David's previous presentation, we're funded by the Foreign Office directly. So that's our home base, as it were, and they pay for all our costs. So the history of the cadre. Founded in 1819, roughly, bringing together really a number of unstructured or uncoordinated appointments that were ongoing at the time. Leslie, currently still in Nigeria. At the time, I was in Afghanistan, in Kabul. and it was decided that the best way to bring everything together would be under one overarching group. I was there for 2 years, something of that sort of nature. Leslie's been in Nigeria about that length. Andy has started in Kenya about 2 or 3 months ago, something of that sort of nature. So why HMPPS? Well, the history was that for the period of, or the issue of detentions, it was about relevance and cost. The relevance was, at the time, they were using policemen historically to assess conditions of detentions. Now, as much as we don't take anything away from police and what they do, they clearly have a very limited role in the way of detention conditions, those being for a very short period post-arrest and pre-trial or pre-submission into a remand centre, that sort of stuff. So we came along to add some weight not only to the period of pre-trial, where people are kept in maybe remand conditions for many months or in some cases years, and to be able to assist host governments in regard of what their conditions should be like. Also, as against contractors, because there's a number of contracting firms out there who wish to supply training and experience to that sphere. We're, believe it or not, quite a lot cheaper on a day-to-day basis. So that's why we came into being. Took quite a bit of work to get to the point that we're at now, and still we've got some work to do in that regard. We've just moved group from a number of secondments where people were asked to second into the specific pieces of work. Mine was advertised, for instance, through the Prison Governors Association. It wasn't advertised via HMPPS, but it was decided to bring us all under one roof. So that's where we're in the process of doing at the moment. So what to expect? Well, this is a picture from my recent holiday. This isn't a picture from a recent deployment overseas by any means. So what you might not expect is that, if we're honest, the countries that we currently work into, as I've noted, are a little bit different and a little bit more challenging than maybe the beach holiday that we would all hope. The reality is very unlikely to be that beach scene. They're usually hot countries, they're usually dusty and dirty in Africa and Asia, but we have to have some work in Europe as well. It's a different culture, and when I say that, I don't only mean the host governments that we go and work with, although clearly they've got a different history and culture bringing them up to the point they're at currently. But also the FCDO was very, very different. Diplomatic skills are something that I and maybe some of the other team will stick up their hand and admit to having to learn across the line. They can be very complicated and quite subtle and a bit more difficult than you might believe. This can be a challenge to me personally, and I think most of the current team would stick up their hand and say that as overtly operational staff from HMPPS, it can be a bit of a challenge sometimes speaking to people who work in a different part of our own government, a different language, a different set of etiquette, a different set of rules. So yeah, that can be difficult. It's something that we learn every day. Every day is a school day, as it were, but we continue to do that. And also a big challenge to us personally is the conditions we'll come across and the accepted norms. Tabs was talking about it a few moments ago, so I'll add to that. Not only are we looking at conditions of decency and safety and security and human rights and legal compliance and that sort of stuff. And the question that was asked was, do we act outside our authority? Basically, we don't have an authority. As Brian said a few moments ago, we're all guests. We're invited into countries. We don't go along and say this is what you should do in that blatant a way. We're invited in, so we have to act beyond our authority by using our influence and relationships in order to get to the point that we want to in order to influence change. So what do? Well, we basically assess and mitigate the risk to the UK of working with countries with maybe questionable human detention rights standards or possible breaches even. So we test out on 3 key elements, and those are willingness, compliance and capability. So first and foremostly, is the host government willing to work with us, to listen to us, to engage and to change? And that is probably the starting point, because if the host government, although we're invited in at a very senior level, when you get to the operational level, that level of willingness to change and to listen and to engage can sometimes be a challenge. Obviously, they are senior people. Sometimes they can be civil judicial systems, but they can also be military judicial systems. So therefore, they will have a level of authority within their own organisations, and getting them to engage with us sometimes when they've been told to can be a challenge to us. Compliance. What's the current situation on the ground as against human rights, and how can they improve? Well, that leads us to obviously assess or audit, and maybe in cooperation with them write an action plan in order to see how they can change. But also, do they have the capability to do so? Do the hosts have the structures, the management culture, and can we change that through training or mentoring or coaching? That would be the ideal, that they would come to the table with those sorts of elements already thought through. That is a journey, if I'm honest, in my experience. It's a journey to get them from where they are currently to where they need to be in order to change. And again, we've got to be very careful. Sometimes we're going into ex-Commonwealth countries or countries where we can't be seen to be imperialistic and coming along and just telling people what to do. It is very much a partnership with that country. So how, where and why, or why, how and where should I say? So why? Well, it's in pursuit of the government objectives for human rights and legal judicial systems throughout the world. So we can offer assistance through the development programme. Basically, you'll be aware, I hope, of the UK commitment of 0.5 of GDP. And to do that, to spend that money abroad, specifically in programmes that relate to criminal justice, we need to know that their programmes are legally compliant. We're looking mostly at the full spectrum of the criminal justice system. So although we're detentions people, there will be people from the judicial system. I worked with a retired judge in Kabul. I also had serving and ex-policemen, so serving from SO15, from Scotland Yard, but also ex-policemen under contracts to do training under forensics or whatever might be needed in order to help them to do that. So how we do that is through training. As I said, we do an audit. We have what we call an international pursuit assessment framework, which is an audit of another name. So we use that. We use action plans. We are feet on the ground regularly in detention centres. We might organise study trips back to the UK. We will look to assist embassies or high commissions in their investment programme. The big thing in there is, again, going back, I suppose, a little bit to what Tabs was saying, is about sustainability. It's all very well going along and spending £20,000, £50,000 or whatever you might want to do in order to invest in either buildings or people or processes or equipment. But you've got to really look beyond the obvious and think about the sustainability of that project. What would it be like if we left? Would it be able to continue? Do they have the funds for things like maintenance, for licenses, for the upkeep of the building, for even the consumables needed for training, for instance. So you've got to look beyond the obvious in that respect, because what we can't do is spend British taxpayers' money, especially in this environment currently back in the UK, without knowing what we're going to get for it and that it will be sustainable in the long term. You can only do that on the best judgment of the day, because obviously political faces change abroad as they do regularly back in the UK. We might also speak to detainees via interviews or by focus groups in order to find out what it is like on the ground from their perspective. So as I said, we're currently working in Kenya, Nigeria. We've got a team going to Iraq at the end of this week, and we're developing further relationships around the world. So I'll let Leslie just jump in here. This is a project we invested in Nigeria.
Good afternoon, everyone, from hot and sunny Nigeria. Hopefully my internet will hold out. That's another one of the great advantages of working overseas, is internet drops in and out when it feels like it. So just going back over some of the things that Nigel was saying, my personal experience of working in Nigeria, it's very hierarchical. So if I want to do anything with the prison service, I need to go and speak to their controller general, which is the equivalent of our CEO, and that's the only way I can get work done. And he will then filter it down into the prisons, and they will engage them once the CGC has said that they can do that. It's also about learning their culture. So we're very direct in the UK. If we have a meeting, we go in, hello, good afternoon, right, what I need is, well, here you have to talk for a good 5 or 10 minutes about how was your night, how's your family. So you just have to talk rubbish for 10, 15 minutes before you can actually do business, but that's just how they do it. So obviously being a female as well in a country where females don't have the same privileges as we do in the UK, that can be quite a challenge sometimes too. An example of that is when I first came to Nigeria, my predecessor was a male. We went to the prison and he said, oh, can I just introduce you to Leslie? She's going to be taking over from me. And he literally looked me up and down and said, what, a woman for a male? So he was quite astounded that a female was coming in to do it. But you learn to get over that. So in Nigeria, we've trained some of the local prison staff into trainers to be able to deliver a training package that we have dealing with high-risk prisoners. And one of their issues is their training schools aren't very good. You know, we might all think as prison staff that Newbolt's not great, but if you come and see one of these training schools, you'll realise it's wonderful. I mean, a lot of them, you know, if there's 200 people coming, there's only 150 mattresses, so the other 50 have to sleep on the floor. That's kind of how it is. So this is a training unit that we built for them in a city called Kaduna, so that they would be able to run the training courses. So it's fully kitted out with desks and chairs and whatever they need to deliver training. But it was also a unit that they would be able to use for their own training as well. So it wasn't just for us, it's for them to use. Do you want to go on to the next one, Nige? Okay, so this is some of the prison staff that I work with in Nigeria. We arranged a study trip for them, and one of the days was going to Newbold. All the people here are working within the training sector within the Nigerian prison service. So they got an opportunity to come over and talk to some of the trainers at Newbold and read the quotes on the wall and get some inspiration. I think one of the biggest things that came out of that is obviously we deliver in small groups and it's very interactive. You know, we get people to do stuff, which is how we learn. In Nigeria, they lecture to 300 to 500 students with just one person standing at the front talking for about 3 hours. So the training college in Kaduna have actually adopted the smaller approach and being more interactive. So that's really good to see. Okay, Nigel.
Thanks. Okay, so what you can expect to see overseas, should you be blessed enough to go to a prison site, it will be the sights and the smells. Again, as we say back in the UK, you know, in British prisons, they can be smelly at times, and you can see things and hear things that you won't want to. But overseas, rampant overcrowding is in place, poor sanitation, impoverished regimes, basic lack of health provision, and basic food and unfiltered water. To add some meat to the bone on that, when I was in Afghanistan, well, it was interesting really, because the two things. One's the cells would hold between 4 and 40 people, something of that sort of nature. But when I spoke to prisoners and asked them if they would prefer to be in a single cell accommodation, not that that was available at the time, but if they would prefer that, it was understanding the cultural differences as well. That they live in large family groups. And when I mentioned a single cell, as far as they were concerned, that was a punishment cell. Why would I want to be in a cell by myself, even though it's got no sanitation? They would much prefer to be in a large cell with other people. So it's important to be open-minded in that respect then. So you've got to really understand the culture. You know, we all, I think, I'm going to speak for Andy as well, I'm not absolutely sure, but we all use interpreters. And I know when I was in Kabul, I didn't use, I won't call my interpreter an interpreter. He was an advisor, because as much as they would translate your words and those of the staff at the other side back to you, the greatest thing that my advisor brought to me was actual cultural relevance of where I was working and understanding day to day what was needed. So it's important to be open-minded to look where we can build, where investment, and I mean by that time and money, will achieve the greatest outcome. So when we link up with programmatic people in the embassies, they will have results frameworks that they need to achieve. So I had to really assist them in saying what they could achieve for their money in the time that they had available. And it's very easy to be think about the bigger things and the things that might go on posters somewhere, but actually just getting a daily food ration of a good quality was something that I had to negotiate to bring the prison service alongside out there in order to make sure that the prisoners are well fed. And then you'd obviously have things about like maybe the visits regime. Obviously, Afghanistan was a Muslim country, 99% Muslims, and therefore they had different visits. So for ladies and gentlemen to visit their families. So therefore you can't impose regimes we would have over here in the UK. You've got to be very culturally aware, for instance. So next question, the next one. This is probably more like what a prison visit will be like. This is off the internet. It's not a view of any of the sites that we visit currently, but it is atypical of what you might see. There's no two ways about that. So when we talk about sights and smells and sounds, this is the sort of stuff that we're going to be met by. And when we've come from HMP in the UK, it really is quite a shock, if I'm honest, for me. When I first went out to see these things, having worked in the prison service for over 30 years before I did that, the givens just aren't there. It's as simple as that. Some countries in the world, if family don't bring in food, people don't eat. You know, it's as simple as that. You know, prisoners will share their items with each other. The healthcare is very rudimentary. You might have a visiting doctor for a day or two a week. You might have very few drugs in the store in order to help or treat people. You certainly won't have dentistries and x-ray machines and that sort of stuff. It just doesn't exist. So you have to work with what you've got in order to get to the place you want to get to. And small steps, small victories are really important to keep hold of. So living and working abroad. Well, currently what we do in the CARDA, we are typically away between 2 and 6 weeks at a time. So it's quite isolating, or can be. I have, you know, missed grandkids' birthdays, births, deaths, marriages, Christmases, deaths of family members. It's not easy to live with that sort. So you need a high level of resilience if you're going to do that. The posts can be varied. So we've got people working in Europe. We've got people in East and West Africa. Obviously, Kabul at the time was a hostile post, so there is definitely personal risk involved. We all have to go through particular training to work with close protection teams, for instance, to work in some of these countries. And we have military or ex-military staff looking after us quite a lot. Living conditions vary from everything. If we're going for a 2-week stint, it might be a hotel in a capital city somewhere. But it also, if you get to embassies, might be a shared accommodation, shared houses, or I, for 2 years, was living in a converted 40-foot shipping container. That was my home for 2 years, and you make it very personable, and the embassy work very hard to help you, but it can be a bit intense at times to live and work with the same people in your team for literally 24/7. We had a communal dining area, for instance. That was the place to eat unless you were in one of the houses. So downtime can be hard to manage. You've got to be self-sufficient. You've got to be happy with your own self in respect of what you can do with that time. And there are restricted to movements potentially depending on where you are. There's certainly no sightseeing. I remember my now 89-year-old mother asking me to bring photos back of the Hindu Kush and places that she thought I could go on a weekend. It just doesn't happen. I saw very little of Afghanistan. Concrete walls, really, inside the green zone. That was it. I know others have got a little bit more freedom to go and explore, but there is always risk, and therefore you have to be mindful of that. That said, the flip side, it can be fun. There's a high sense of community at embassies abroad. I've found lots of people are in the same boat, so therefore they make the best of what they've got. Lots of community spirit, lots of activities, barbecues, fancy dress parties, whatever it may be, and they certainly celebrate events like Christmas, Queen's birthday party, whatever, in order to maximise that time together. So, is it a new horizon? Well, you certainly see the world differently. As I say, albeit not tourist hotspots, but you can get to scratch off on your little world atlas where you've been in the world that some people don't get to go. You certainly learn from new cultures, and embedding with local staff is really, really important, and they add so much to it. You experience life, albeit somewhat limited in a different country. You see how other prison services work and detention settings, and actually Leslie added this bit, and I absolutely get it, because you maybe learn to appreciate a little bit more about what we've got back in the UK. We very often point fingers at our own organisations, but actually when you learn how other organisations work overseas, you come back to the point that actually maybe it's not as bad as we think. We've already spoke about country-based staff, absolutely invaluable, absolutely invaluable. And you're working with people and departments we would never do in HMPPS when you're in embassies, political teams, defence, humanitarian development, consular, for instance. And although your work might not directly be in lockstep with them, you certainly learn a lot, and you can, believe it or not, bring a lot of your experience to bear in things like consular and defence and political teams. You get asked a lot of interesting questions, and not just from an outsider's point of view, just looking in, asking what you do, but asking what we can do to assist. So we might become involved in their crisis management roles and that sort of stuff as well. Leslie, Andy, anything you want to add before we open up for questions?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Nigel said. It's the country-based staff that you work with are the most important people. I have a lady who works with me called EA, and I couldn't do my job without her. She can explain to me how to handle a situation, how to deliver a message. She gets me all my appointments because I don't speak Hausa. Allegedly they speak English over here, but they can never understand me and I can't understand them. So, they are invaluable. And, we've shown you the worst side. It is actually really good work to do, and you get a lot of job satisfaction. Very frustrating, and it's very slow paced, as Nigel said, but it is very satisfying.
Andy, do you want to add anything or not? It's, no pressure if you don't.
No, I mean, everything that I would say would be echoing what's already been said. The the sensitivities around protocols and politics in every country is different, but similar in manner of what you've described. Here in Kenya, yeah, exactly the same. That you've got 20 minutes, half an hour of chatting before anything actually kind of gets progressed. You've got to be careful of who walks in a room first and who exits the room first, who speaks first and who finishes the speaking in every meeting. Yeah, you end up. I've found that my experience now is I'm acting almost like as a semi-diplomat rather than a prison service member of staff. You're engaged in some gatherings where you'll be dealing with ministers. Last night I was at a gathering with the head of the KPS, Kenya Prison Service, head of aviation, chief magistrates, head of the Department of Criminal Investigations, people like that. So you're really dealing at a different level, and you just have to be aware of cultural and political sensitivities. Soon over in Kenya, in the summer this year, there's going to be elections, which is always kind of a little bit of a contentious time. So we have to be aware of that as well, of who we deal with and who we don't deal with and how we speak to them. So there's all those additional things that you need to be aware of when dealing dealing with our partners in different countries. The prisons, again, like you described some of the conditions, Kenya specific, throwbacks to the days of the empire. A lot of the prisons here were actually built by the British, so and very reminiscent of that as you walk in. So really challenging, but as everyone has said, really exciting, really rewarding work. Just to kind of add on to everything that everyone's already said.
All right, Brian, we'll throw it up for questions if anybody wants to venture and see if we can put us on the spot.
Okay, thanks very much, Nigel, Leslie, and Andy. That's really useful. I should just explain, just remind everybody that the 6 members of the HMPPS cadre are all full-time members of this type of work. They were all selected in conjunction with the Foreign Office, and then were put through quite intensive Foreign Office training in order to prepare themselves for overseas work, because as Nigel has described, some of the countries we work in are pretty I will call it inhospitable, but certainly I think very different from Western standards. And obviously the staff had to be prepared to work in those types of environment. Those posts are advertised. They do come up on an annual basis, I suppose, but they do involve, although the secondments overseas are 6 to 8 weeks at a time, it is a full-time post within HMPPS. There's a slight difference from the other secondments that we've been talking about. Right, can I ask, I think we've just got a question in from Helen. Leslie and Andrew, what are your current grades, please?
I'm an operational band 8.
Yeah, that's the same for me. Operational band 8.
Yeah, but just to add to that, so am I. But just to add to that, the way the cadre looks at it is it's about skills and it's about the personality. So we've got a range of people. Obviously, the boss is a band 10, and we've got a couple of band 5s currently. And depending on how our education goes with different embassies around the world, that will either draw different skills that are needed. But I can't see it dropping below band 5 currently, which is a CM, custodial manager or above, really, because of the diplomatic risks involved.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, this, because the key thing for me would be having the relevant relevant experience and skills, a lot of which is actually about communication, because you're working in a different culture. You've got to be really sensitive to the differences between UK culture and the host culture. There's also the expectations, because although the input may be very practical and on the ground stuff, you're dealing with high level officials who expect to be dealing with officials of similar grades. So it's a real balancing act about how you actually get the right skills, the right person in position, but also meeting the expectations of the host country as well. So yeah, it's a very difficult one to manage. Okay, any other questions then, please, for the team so far? I can't see anything coming up from anybody. No, right. I think Nigel, Leslie and Andy, you've actually stunned everybody with your your descriptions of the work you've undertaken. Thanks very much. That very graphic description, that's very useful. And I think it does shows the range of work that our staff are actually involved in. Right, I'm now going to pass over to Paul Yates, Governor of HMP Nottingham. We were approached back end of last year to ask if we could send two of our senior managers over to Bahrain to look at how we could make recommendations about improving their staff training and also observations on their prison system as a whole. So Paul from Nottingham and Sean Omerod from Holm House went there for 2 weeks in, I think it was January now. So Paul, I'll hand over to you for your experiences then.
Brian, good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody else. As Brian just said, my name is Paul Yates. I'm the governing governor of HMP Nottingham, and I'm a Band 11, as is Sean Ormond, who is the governor of HMP Home House. I thought I'd probably start with just how we kind of got to do this first piece of work, which hopefully might turn into future pieces of work if we were good enough. But moreover, I met Brian, or I had contact with Brian, because he'd approached me as a governor of HMP Lincoln to host prison officers coming over for short periods. And that's where we got to do that, which was a really interesting piece of work. We had some staff from the Caribbean, from the Cayman Islands in particular. So that's how I really got to know Brian. So I then, I'm unusual in the sense that I started in the probation service in 1993, did 14 years of the last 7 as an assistant chief probation officer in Derby. Then I kind of got bored and jumped to the prison service, and I've been a governor now for just under 9 years. So I had done 3 years at HMP North Sea Camp. I'd done 5 years at Lincoln, and I was sort of reflecting really on what else I wanted to do, and the kind of international project work, something that's been on my kind of portfolio wish list for some time really. So I, at a time when I was thinking about my next steps, refreshed my CV and sent it to Brian actually, and said if there's anybody in the international team that may be able to use our services, then we'd really appreciate that. So nothing happened for quite a few months actually, but then we got a call out of the blue to say this piece of work was coming up. Now, it's the first piece of work for myself and Sean. We are both experienced governing governors, and initially the brief was that the Kingdom of Bahrain had asked for support in relation to actually the training needs assessments for its prison officers, which was the first element. And that was a joint piece of work with the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Justice, working closely with the Bahraini Ministry of Interior. And initially we got sort of impression and some advice from the other colleagues that the brief was potentially quite wide rather than the narrow aspect of it, which was the important part for us to follow, moreover. So we did our research and as one does, and looked a lot at YouTube and Google to see what Bahrain is like and what the history is and that of the prisons out there. And certainly presented a really interesting picture of a technically, in Western terms, quite a young country, but with a very, very long history going back thousands of years. But moreover, a country that is in a position of having oil and therefore being able to buy quite a lot of things. Similarly as well, that research identified a number of things, which is that the Kingdom of Bahrain population is only about 1.7 million, I think it was. But when you actually get there, you realise that nearly half that population is actually foreign workers, and the Bahraini population itself is actually very small. Now, as both of the written reports for investigations on a number of occasions, so we had that experience and skill. So we asked initially for, of course, advice and guidance, which we received a lot, including from the embassy, British Embassy in Bahrain, which was really, really helpful, and from Nigel and the team. And that gave us a really good understanding, I think, of some of the sensitivities. What Sean and I didn't want to do was to go over there as, you know, that kind of colonial aspect and be telling people over there what to do, and trying to understand the cultural aspect of Bahrain, I think, was one of the critical things that we put a lot of time and effort into. But we initially requested a lot of information, which is the normal protocol for when we're writing reports, which then allows you to almost form a picture of what you're walking into. And we were a little bit puzzled at first that we didn't have any information, and we wondered if this was cultural in the sense of not wanting to share that information. But I think by the end we realized that our perception and understanding that everything is written down is not a universally held position or culture or aspect. So it then became about trying to understand the culture and how it works. Now, the King of Bahrain, the prison service, which really in essence relates to 4 prisons, is actually called, or it's been recently renamed, the General Directorate of Reform and Rehabilitation. And there it's part of the Ministry of Interior, which is, I guess, akin to the Home Office in that regard. And you'll recall that a number of years ago that the Probation and Prison Service was taken out of the Home Office and placed in the Ministry of Justice. And part of that was the kind of conflict of interest between the police work and then what we do in prisons and probation. And it was interesting then to understand that actually the prisons out there are run by the police, and the process would appear to be that one goes to police college and learns your completes your training there, and then you apply to where you'd want to go in the police force, so traffic or special investigations, etc., or prisons, and therefore you handed an envelope and basically told that you were going to prison, which we kind of worked out after a bit was probably the least welcoming place for prison staff to go, police officers. And as a country with a varied approach to custody, what the Bahrain has been able to do is actually buy that in, and I think they've been looking around the world to buy that in. So the newest prison that we went to, which is called Jau, which was in essence a prison that holds up to 2,000 prisoners, men in this regard, and they were holding 1,600 at that point in time. But if you can imagine the kind of Shawshank Redemption type prison where you've got the large walls, large towers with staff with shotguns and rifles and machine guns, etc., then that's what the prison looked like. But inside, it was a series of small house blocks, which were all very new. And our first thing was really to try and understand the kind of culture and how things are. And I think Nigel made a really interesting point earlier on that much of the blocks were, in essence, blocks that would hold 3-story blocks, which would hold up to nearly 360 prisoners in each one. But they segregated prisoners by offence. So the first one we got took to was, in essence, the financial fraud type inmates or offenders, and it was quite pretty decent in there. They would be on different floors. They would separate them out. But the facilities there were not what we're used to. And what puzzled us slightly was the lack of interaction between staff and the inmates, but moreover, the lack of written documentation or standard operating procedures, as they referred to them. So that clearly became something that they were interested in. And we explained that the prison probation service, everything's written down. So we're in the process of sharing that and have been doing since. But of course, bearing in mind that some of the things out there will not fit in the way that they do here. And of course, very similarly, I think, to some of the Caribbean islands and smaller islands, that Bahrain is a very small country in essence, and everybody knows everybody in that regard. So even though if you're an inmate in one of the prisons out there, you will have a very close relationship with people in the community. And a number of the staff said that they live next door to families where one of their loved ones is in prison. So that brings another pressure, I think, in that regard. Similarly, that we talked about accommodation, and sort of they shared with us their concept of accommodation, and much of it was dormitory focused. And again, we have some discussions with some of the inmates to say, would you prefer a single cell or a double cell? And they were horrified that they would even consider that, which again was about a cultural thing linked to how families in Bahrain live as families in that regard. So that was really interesting, and again started to direct our kind of thinking about where we were, what we were going to propose. As I said earlier on, the British Embassy were fantastic actually and gave some really interesting information, and certainly understanding that probably up to the half of the government was staffed by people from the same family, from the Khalifa family, which are the royal family out there, and that was particularly interesting trying to understand the culture. And we got to meet very formally Sheikh Nasser over there, who's the Undersecretary to the Ministry of Interior, and he was very clear in what he wanted and expected. One of the interesting points was the kind of conflict between the police and the fact there wasn't a prison service as such, and how the fact that you may arrest somebody but then also be looking after them in prison was certainly a conflict of interest across there. We were also interested in what prisoners did all day, and they were very clear in saying yes, prisons are occupied, they have lots to do. So again, we talked about can we see this please? So we then worked out of the 1,600, there was 36 training places or education places in the prison. So again, keeping prisons occupied was something that would fit the brief in terms of reducing refractory behaviour in the prison from prisoners. But what then happened was we had what one might refer to as a handler, a member of the Ministry of Interior that kind of looked after us, for want of a better phrase, and sort of guided where we went. But once we were able to speak to some of the senior officers there and get to know them a little better, actually we got a really quite a warm and differing picture of how it works out there. And similarly, part of the project is that they came over here as well. So Sean and I have hosted 2 groups in our prisons, and that's been really, really useful. And I think seeing what we're talking about, as well as picking ideas of things that we didn't even know that they were interested in, has been particularly helpful, and certainly sharing information. One's minded that we looked at the communication system out there in the prison, and they use WhatsApp. So in essence, you take your personal phone into the prison, and if you want to speak to a member of staff on another unit, you just WhatsApp them, basically, which we were kind of puzzled by. But moreover, the concept of how that is insecure was not something that they'd worked out. But moreover, so we shared how we do it here, etc. But overall, we were really clear that we are representing the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Justice, and ensuring that we are culturally sensitive to our behaviour out there in particular, but also understanding that we are guests in that country, and we offered very clearly that this was an offer. This is what works in certain parts of the UK, in UK prisons, may work in a male prison but not in a female prison, and actually these things that might be of interest to you, but actually by undertaking X, Y and Z, it can often have, for example, a better improvement aspect or influence on prisoners who are being refractory or misbehaving. It was a really interesting experience actually, in a too short a period really, although it was of course a scoping exercise, and we have kept in contact with some of the senior managers in both prisons, in the female and male prisons, etc. So we'll continue to share that information really. But we also picked up some interesting things about the use of technology, and I think when you have the ability, as they do, to buy things off the shelf where money is important, is an issue, but not the same way as it is in the UK, where we're all very strapped for budget. So for example, in my prison, and Sean's as well, of course, that so I get £2.15 per prisoner per day to provide 3 meals, 2 which have to be hot. In Bahrain, it's at least 7 to 12 UK pounds, where they actually buy it in through a caterer. So we were sort of explaining that we get prisoners to cook food here and there's a smaller budget. So they were quite interested in making savings. So while that was not in the scope, it was really interesting actually to understand. Coming back then, we part wrote the report before we came back, but then finished it when we did come back, and that went through a process of sort of vetting and discussion, and it was really interesting to see the subtleties of how the embassy in particular were sort of changing little bits of language that we take for granted over here, particularly in that direct approach that was mentioned earlier on by Leslie, but that we have in the UK, which is often a very direct approach, where in a document that is in part almost a diplomatic document, how you have to think a little bit differently in how you write things in a way that gets the point across but doesn't rely on our cultural norms to try and assist the Bahrainis in this instance to understand. But really interesting. We've got a wash-up session quite soon. The support throughout the whole trip has been really helpful, including the more formal, but some of the informal stuff. And Nigel and some of the others, Brian, etc., have been really helpful. So we felt really supported in that process. Bahrain's a really interesting country. We didn't get to see a great deal of it, I think, as other people have said. Moreover, it was about business, and even when we were on our off town, we were still sort of discussing elements of what we were doing and what we'd seen and what we thought we'd want to recommend, etc. And also bearing in mind how we then briefed the Sheikh, which is not a normal discussion between two governors. It was a high-level discussion where we had to think very carefully about what we were saying in short order to make sure that it's something he would be interested in for the Bahraini prison service, of course, in this instance. But I would like to do some more of this if possible. It's really exciting and interesting. It does take you away from your family, which is not the easiest part of the process. But I think going back to Nigel's point that we were kind of gobsmacked that there's nothing written down. And of course, while that is cultural in some regards, that with many countries around the world, there's an old tradition of history, for example, rather than a written one like we have. So understanding that's quite important. But it was then about how do we support the Bahrainis to ensure that there is consistency in their practice and that the senior grades were able to engage that practice with the lower grades of staff, as they referred to them out there. And there was a really big difference in void in that regard. But also how to use inmates as part of the solution, as we do in the UK. And also that very gently that renaming the prison service the Director of Reform and Rehabilitation doesn't mean it's rehabilitative in what it does. It often is about the environment, the process, the systems, procedural justice, etc. But again, really interesting. So again, any questions that I could ask that you want to ask, please feel free.
Paul, thanks very much for that description of the work undertaken in Bahrain. And as you said, any questions?
Brian, before people might stick their hand up or chat in the bar or whatever, in the chat bar, sorry, just do, yeah, Freudian slip that one, wouldn't it? Just to pick up on the point about written communication within the prisons, I'm sure, I don't know, but I'm sure that the levels of literacy, for instance, in the Bahraini prison service are going to be relatively good on the basis they come through that route. I know that in Nigeria and Kenya and Afghanistan, the people who are locking people up very often have very poor levels of literacy. So therefore, think about how that communication happens for standing operating procedures or governor's orders or whatever you want to call them, notices to staff. That becomes very much word of mouth. Therefore, making change becomes a lot more difficult because Chinese whispers, one shift to another, things get lost in translation. There's all sorts of issues regarding that. So when we go to countries that are particularly problematic in that regard, it's worth bearing that in mind, that this is what makes another complication to the job, really.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. Okay, let's see. What questions have we got so far? I'm just looking to see if anyone's got any questions.
You got Andrew with his hand up there, Brian.
Yeah, Andy, over to you, Andy.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for that. Yeah, just to add further to what Nigel's just said there. Here in Kenya, the prison officer training is 9 months long, so they train 3,000 people for 9 months once a year. But interesting that the level of training once they get into the prison is kind of and the level of literacy and compliance is kind of debatable. So what's interesting for me to see is what are they actually training them to do for those 9 months, and why does it take so long? I get the feeling it's a lot of military parading and time shooting rifles on the range, but should that be focused in other directions? But yeah, sorry, it was just to add further to what Nigel was saying there, and kind of paint the picture of kind of some of the systems that we have to deal with.
Okay, thanks. Right. Anything from anybody else? Any other questions? Not just on Paul's presentation, but across everything that's been discussed so far today. I mean, obviously, we've focused very much upon the work that's involved, and of course, that has been very much about prison focused rather than the wider prison probation world. But I think it'd be useful maybe just to reflect on what it's like to be living in these countries. I mean, Paul, I know you're only in Bahrain for 2 weeks, but what were your reflections on actually being in that community, not on holiday, but actually working there?
Ours was a bit surreal, really, because we ended up in a 5-star hotel with a driver. So again, I guess ours was sort of the top end of the expectation, really. And also, by the second week, some of the senior managers that we'd met in the day sort of asked us out, to go out for a meal or go to their homes, etc. So it's really hospitable. But I think our experience was not the norm. I don't think you'd normally end up in a 5-star IHG intercontinental prison, etc. Sorry, prison hotel. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, but it was very useful in terms of being able to get about, actually, and because we have quite a lot of different meetings, and that been taking around was really, really helpful in terms of best use of our time. But it also allowed us, because it was the modern rooms with with IT, that we could actually start thinking about and doing some of the work as we went along in terms of making notes, sharing notes, looking at priorities, and briefing the team back in the UK.
Right. And in terms of safety, did Bahrain feel safe?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely safe at all. It was an interesting experience. I remember looking out the window one day and I thought, oh, it's really foggy. I thought it must be because of the sea. Then we walked out and I looked up into the wind and got about 2 pounds of grit in my eye. So I didn't do that again because it was actually a sandstorm. But no, it was really, really safe. And I think crime is very low out there. There's very low tolerance to crime, even low levels of crime. And I think it was very, very safe, actually. And we were close to one of the old souks, so it was in quite a working class migrant labour area. But again, it was very, very safe. There was police all over the place, and most were armed, albeit some of the weapons they had looked a bit ancient. But no, it was very, very safe. There was nothing at all we had in concerns. I mean, in terms of the experience of Leslie, again, it's a different culture, isn't it? The Sheikh, when he was talking to us at the end, made what I consider quite a racist comment that offended me. But of course, it's a situation where I let that slide because of not wanting to cause offence, albeit that wasn't the time I needed to make that retort. So, one's minded again that some of the cultural norms I expect in the UK are not necessarily the same in countries, even where they are full of very tall buildings, skyscrapers, and very expensive watches, etc.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting contrast to the picture you paint in Bahrain to that from Nigel, Andy, and Leslie in Nigeria, Afghanistan, and less salubrious places. So I think the work we do really does vary right across the board. But
Brian, can I just add? I think the thing that we omitted to say specifically from our team is how we gain support or deconflict, particularly in investment, when you think about other organisations, for instance, the UN, ICRC, international NGOs, or even local NGOs as well. It's definitely worth scoping to see who's working in the field you're putting your foot in. Because if we're not careful, we're all acutely aware of the current cost of living crisis and all those sorts of things, but we're spending taxpayers' money each time we go out there. We're spending taxpayers' money each time we invest. So it's worth spending some time finding out who else is in that field. And from an embassy point of view, Paul spoke about the British Embassy in Bahrain. I haven't found a bad embassy yet, if I'm honest, or High Commission. They are very connected. They know who's in their patch and who's doing what. So it's certainly worth finding out either prior to going or on landing, whichever, who's working in the field you are, and therefore any reports or recommendations you might make, it is worth certainly looking at who else is investing in the same place, because some of the countries we work to in our part of the world at least a little bit desperate for cash, so they will look at many avenues to fill those gaps, and maybe not quite as open to say they've got some cash from somebody to do the same work that we're looking to do.
I mean, there are some fun bits as well. We were, so in Bahrain, the culture is that there's rarely sort of a big meeting table. It tends to be everybody sits around the sides, which is, I think, how in Bahrain they live as well, in that kind of Arabic culture. And rank does have a relevance, because the sheikh would always sit slightly in front of other ranks behind him. So we were sat in this really large room with probably 15 Bahraini senior police officials and the sheikh, who was then sort of talking to me and then talking to the deputy ambassador. And I saw two of the sort of colonels sort of whisper something in Arabic to each other, and they all started nudging each other across the line and saying something. And then somebody, I could see them looking down. Well, my colleague Sean paid silly amounts of money to buy odd socks from the odd sock company. So he was sat there with his very expensive odd socks on. So you could see all these Lieutenant General, the Colonel, going around nudging each other, saying something while the Sheikh's talking. So I said, Sean, they're looking at your socks. So then he put his trousers up a bit. And about a few days later, they admitted that they were laughing their heads off. So it was quite amusing. But we learned quite a lot from the non-verbal body language and communication. And even though we don't understand Arabic in any aspect, you can pick a lot and you can communicate quite closely with non-verbal language and how you interact non-verbally or with your body language. And that's quite a useful skill, actually, that I think Nigel mentioned at some point in our numerous briefings. But yeah, there are some good bits as well. And actually, on the way back, we Sean says, "Oh, is the Bahrain Grand Prix anywhere near?" And the driver says, "Yeah, it's just around the corner." I says, "Oh, can we go and have a look?" So I thought, I'm not bothered, it's boring. So anyway, he took us around the corner on the way home, and then Sean says, "Oh, it's shut." I says, "Oh," so I knocked on the gate. I says, "Oh, is there any chance having a look, mate?" So the chap says, "Yeah, come in and have a look." So we got to walk around the stand and have a look in the shop. But if you don't ask, you don't get here. So it was quite an anticlimax for me, but Sean was really excited about it. But yeah, so there are.
So you see, there are advantages to this work. You can go to the Grand Prix in Bahrain, or you can go to Caribbean beaches, or enjoy the sights of Nigeria. It does vary. Okay, any other questions from anybody else this afternoon, please? No, nothing's coming up. Well, in that case, thank you very much to all the contributors this afternoon. I think the descriptions you provide of the work we do overseas hopefully has been of interest to everybody on the call, and does demonstrate the breadth of work that we do get involved in. So my thanks to everybody for doing that. Secondly, I'll put a quick advert up. Next Wednesday, the 18th of May at 1 o'clock, there is a session on longer term overseas projects. These are projects of 2 years or more, where people are actually doing long-term secondments, career breaks, whatever, in other countries. We've got Laura Aston and her colleague David, both probation officers in St Helena, and also Nicola Robinson, probation officer in the Falkland Islands. And they'll be joined by Jay Kendall, who is the prison manager in St Helena, and slightly closer to home, Susie Richardson, who's the governor of HMP Lamoille on Jersey. So they'll be talking about their experiences and be a bit more balance, I suppose, between probation and prisons, whereas today's sessions has been very much about prisons. For all those people who have been listening into this, if you want any more information about what you've heard or any other questions, please send me an email. I'll either answer you directly or pass over to one of my colleagues who've been talking to you today about what's involved. Okay, anything else at this point before we finish? No, in that case, thanks very much for everyone's attention and for your contributions, and have a very nice rest of the afternoon. Thanks very much indeed. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye bye.